Welcome to the Cynthia Van Buren Lecture for the spring of 2025. I'm Dr. Mark Cheatham. I'm Professor of History and Project Director for the Papers of Martin Van Buren. Thank you for coming out. This was originally intended to take place in February on President's Day, and I know some of you know our speaker was caught up in a snowstorm, sort of, wound up in Atlanta, made it that far, and then had to turn around and go back home. So we were very fortunate that he could come back and make time to visit with us here in April. By way of introduction, I want to talk just a minute about the project and then talk a little bit about Cynthia Van Buren before I introduce our speaker. The Papers of Martin Van Buren has been in existence officially at Cumberland since 2016. We launched on President's Day that year, in fact. We transcribe, annotate, and digitize the documents of President Martin Van Buren, who was the 8th President of the United States. He followed Andrew Jackson, so for those of you who are native Tennesseans, that's his connection in terms of the presidential succession. Our purpose is to make Martin Van Buren's documents accessible to the public, and so our primary focus is on making them available digitally for free, to anyone who wants to consult them, teachers, scholars, just people who are interested. We also are doing a print edition, a selected 4-volume print edition that hopefully will be out sometime in the next decade, knock on wood. So that's our purpose, that's our objectives as a project. I want to introduce a couple of people who work on the project. Dr. Andrew Wiley, who's editor of the project, he's here on the front row. And then Associate Editor Dr. Max Mathern, who Dr. Wiley's been here since 2018, Dr. Mathern since 2021, and they really do the daily work of making sure that the project runs. And then we also have some interns, some undergraduate students here at Cumberland who work on the project. So if you would either stand or raise your hand if you're an intern or have been an intern on the project. So there's Ashley. I thought there was somebody else here. So we usually have 3 interns per year who work on the project. We've had about 50 interns over the roughly 10 years of the project, and I hope it's been a rewarding experience. So I want to talk briefly about Cynthia Van Buren, who is the person who donated the money for this lecture series. Cynthia was a philanthropist in Florida. She's a Van Buren family member. We connected with her probably in 2017, 2018, our VP for advancement at that time went to visit her in Florida, had a great time. There were stories that were told about that experience that I cannot share with you, but apparently they had a great time on a yacht. That's all I remember. Cynthia was someone who was full of life, and unfortunately she passed away just a few years ago. And fortunately for us, in her estate bequest, she donated money for this project. And so in conjunction with the administration, we decided to do a couple of things. One, to inaugurate this lecture series in her honor. This lecture series takes place in the spring and in the fall. And we also have undergraduate internships, paid internships that we use to help train students on the project. So we're very grateful for Cynthia's generosity. Even though she's no longer with us, she definitely has left a lasting impact on our project. I want to mention that after the lecture today, Professor Bradley will be over here to my right, your left. He has copies of his book for sale. They're hardcover, $30. We can take a variety of different payments. He will sign them. He will have other people sign them if you want, I think. No, he will be happy to sign them for you. So if you're interested, please come see him afterwards, and he'll be happy to take care of that for you. So I have the distinct privilege of introducing our speaker tonight, James Bradley. Without James, there would be no Papers of Martin Van Buren project. We were talking earlier today at a luncheon about how this project, where the idea of it came from and how it wound up at Cumberland. And I won't go into all the details of that, but the idea really came from James. He's a native New Yorker who had an interest in Van Buren, had an interest in writing a biography of Van Buren, and he approached me about this idea of a project that would digitize Van Buren's documents. And so that's our origin story of how the project began. So he's an extremely important person in terms of the project. He's co-editor, so he has been in the trenches with us doing all the things that we do to make the project accessible to everyone. By training, or at least by practice, he's a journalist. He's a fantastic writer. If you purchase a copy of his book, and he didn't pay me to say this, but if you purchase a copy of his book, you will not be disappointed. I've read the book in various drafts over the years, and it's just gotten better and better. And I think it's a very compelling story about a president that a lot of people don't know a lot about. So I'm just thrilled that he's here. I'm glad that he's able to share some of his knowledge about Van Buren with you, because there's probably no one else on the planet who knows more about Martin Van Buren than James Bradley. So without further ado, I want to introduce my friend, my colleague, and the Van Buren expert extraordinaire, James Bradley.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here at Cumberland, to be back here at Cumberland, not only to be part of the Cynthia Van Buren lecture series, but also to give my personal thanks to this institution for its sponsorship of the papers of Martin Van Buren. I don't know where I'd be without this project, but I can tell you this much: I wouldn't be here right now. I would probably be home in the middle of writing chapter 7, or I could be at a library somewhere trying to get a microfilm reader to work. This project has been incredibly important for me in that it's taken thousands of documents and made them available digitally. And from my perspective, not only as a Van Buren biographer, but as an historian, it's been an invaluable resource. Right now, this project is facing some tough times because of the chaos in Washington. We will get through this. We will get through this because we must get through this. This project is simply too important, and we've come too far, because it is about so much more than just the history of one man, as important as that man was. The life of Martin Van Buren encompasses the entirety of the early American Republic. So when you study the life of Martin Van Buren, it's the War of 1812, it's the Missouri Compromise, it's all the presidential elections from 1812 all the way up until 1860. It's the battles over slavery and the Indian Removal Act and the tariffs and the presidential elections and so much more, the Mexican War and westward expansion. All of it's covered in the Van Buren papers. And there's going to be a time, and not too long from now, when any scholar of political antebellum U.S. history is going to need the papers of Martin Van Buren. So that's why we can't retreat right now. So I'm really confident that despite everything we're going through, we will persevere. My lecture here tonight is going to be about what I think is a misunderstood episode in Van Buren's life. It's one of the most controversial decisions of his career, and that was his decision in 1848 to leave the Democratic Party, the party he had helped found, that he had built and sort of nurtured to become the driving force in American politics. He left it in 1848 to run for president on an anti-slavery ticket, the Free Soil Party. And I think this is a misunderstood episode in his life. So it's one that still divides historians today, and I don't think my book is going to settle the matter, but at least you're going to get my take on it right now. Got to backpedal a little bit because there's a great backstory to this, to the 1848 presidential election. Martin Van Buren is elected the 8th president of the United States in 1836. He has a miserable 4 years as president. The nation is mired in an economic crisis that he is never quite able to dig himself out of. He loses the presidency in 1840, and he loses it rather badly to the person he beat in 1836, William Henry Harrison, the man they all made fun of not too long earlier for Granny Harrison. They called him old, they called him feeble. He was 68 years old. Now, I know that's a youngster by today's standards for a presidential candidate, but in 1840, it was sort of a novelty to see someone at that age running for president, and the Democrats made a lot of fun over this. But Harrison surprised a lot of people. He did a lot of campaigning on the stump, and the Whig Party, which was the Democratic Party's opposition party, wins in 1840. And even though Van Buren loses the election, and he loses it by a lot, there's still a lot of people who want him to run again for president in 1844. But he says no. He's going to retire from politics. He's going to return to his hometown in upstate New York of Kinderhook, New York, and he's going to live the remainder of his days as a gentleman farmer. This was sort of a tradition right at that time for ex-presidents. William Henry Harrison dies 1 month into his presidency. The new president is John Tyler, who is an ex-Democrat, recently converted to the Whig Party, and he's kind of an acrimonious person, and he finds a way to antagonize everybody in Washington, including who was then the leader of the Whig Party, Henry Clay. So it is obvious that no one's going to nominate John Tyler for president in 1844. So there's going to be an open race for the presidency in 1844, and right away Henry Clay announces that he's going to run for president. Meanwhile, Martin Van Buren, he's back on his farm, and he's giving this image to the world that he's a very contented farmer growing his cabbage and peas and things like that. But deep down, that political world that he had immersed himself in for decades, he's having a hard time letting it go. And when the letters start arriving saying, "We want you to run for president," he starts to take this more seriously. He travels around the country, really building the rudiments of another presidential run in 1844. And it really looks like the nomination is his, so much so that in early 1844, no other name is even being mentioned as a possible candidate for the Democratic nomination that year. And then he is cornered into taking a stand on a subject that has become a really thorny issue in American politics, and that is the annexation of Texas, which is something that's been kind of floated around for a while in American politics and has become more and more heated over the years. So he is asked to take a stand on this issue, and Van Buren writes a very long letter that appears in the Washington Globe, which is the official party newspaper, and other party newspapers around the country, and he says no, he is not in favor of Texas joining the Union. He says maybe there's going to be a time, he says there probably will be a time when Texas joins the Union, but not right now. We would be interfering in our neighbors' politics because Texas at the time was still considered a breakaway republic from Mexico. And furthermore, he was worried about the implications of admitting a large slaveholding territory into the United States. So in the wake of this decision, this announcement that he makes, Van Buren's support among Southern Democrats really plummets. And suddenly, his nomination is looking very much in doubt. The Democratic Party nomination takes place in May of 1844 in the city of Baltimore, and at first, he gets a majority of the delegates to vote for him, but you need 2/3, and he doesn't get the 2/3 vote, and with every subsequent vote, his numbers go down, and it becomes obvious that he is not going to be the Democratic nominee. Finally, the party decides on Tennessee's own James Knox Polk to be the party's nominee for president. Polk wins the presidency. He defeats Henry Clay in 1844. And Van Buren ends up playing a key role in Polk's election. He does a number of things. First, Democrats in New York and really in the Northeast overall and in the North are really quite furious at the way he was treated by the party. They thought this was a man who had been a steadfast friend to the South for many years. Since his first time in Washington, he's been a friend of the South, and he had always made it clear that he was never going to interfere with slavery. He was the first president to ever mention slavery in his inaugural address. And he made it clear that he was opposed to the abolition of slavery in Washington. Time after time, he had made capitulations to the slave power in Washington and really throughout the nation. And I thought that Southern Democrats had turned on him all because he was not in favor of the immediate annexation of Texas. So there was tremendous bitterness among New York Democrats and Northern Democrats on a whole. So Van Buren had to mollify them, and he wrote public statements saying, you've got to come around and support Polk for president, or else we're going to have President Henry Clay, and we don't want that. So he went that, but he actually went a step further than that. When he convinced the most popular Democrat in New York, a man by the name of Silas Wright, who was one of Van Buren's closest advisors, someone who had been a close friend of his for decades, and he really was one of the most popular Democrats, not only in New York, but really in the entire North. And he was a U.S. senator at the time, and he really enjoyed being a U.S. senator. He liked the kind of parliamentary lifestyle, and he didn't want to leave. But Van Buren says to him, I'd like you to run for governor of New York. Because the idea being, if I get a really popular person on this ticket, that will energize a lot of Democrats to come to the polls. Okay? So this proves to be really key in the election. Why? Because Polk wins New York, and he wins it barely. He wins it by about 5,000 votes, which is less than 1% of the vote. If Henry Clay had won New York, he would have been the 11th president of the United States. So Van Buren and New York play really central roles in Polk's election as president. So Van Buren thinks, all right, Polk, you owe me now. I went a long way in trying to keep Democrats from voting or staying home altogether. He wanted to see his people represented in the Polk administration. He wanted 2 cabinet spots to go to his allies, and Polk doesn't give him any. He brings 1 New Yorker into his cabinet, and to make matters worse, he was a leader of a rival faction in the New York Democratic Party. So there was all this bitterness to begin with about how the Democratic Convention in 1844 panned out, and then on top of that, they felt like they were doubly insulted with the way Polk had treated them. So this is this atmosphere of bitterness that really comes into play during the Polk administration, which turns out to be a transformational presidency. Polk takes the nation to war in Mexico. He brings Texas into the Union. He acquires the Oregon Territory and a treaty with Great Britain. Essentially, the nation is doubled under James K. Polk's presidency. And he says from the beginning he's only going to serve 1 term. So he wants to make it count, and boy, did he make it count. I mean, this was, the nation before and after his presidency was a completely different place. And here's where the story takes an interesting turn. As the Mexican War is winding down, Polk makes an appropriation request to Congress. He wants $2 million to help his administration negotiate the terms of a peace treaty with Mexico. And here emerges an unlikely hero in our story. A Democratic congressman from northern Pennsylvania named David Wilmot. He was a nobody. He was a freshman congressman. He was somebody who voted in favor of the Mexican War. He's somebody who got along very well with Southern members of Congress. They even said he was a favorite among the Southerners. He never gave anyone the impression that he was someone to rock the boat. But he was very upset at the way Van Buren was treated. You know, the love we all have for Van Buren in this room, it goes back far. You know, he had his acolytes back then. He had strong supporters in many states, and Wilmot was sort of part of this coalition of Van Burenites. So he introduces an amendment to this appropriation request, and it says, any territory acquired as a result of the Mexican War shall not have slavery in it. And in a neat stroke on his part, he pretty much takes verbatim the language that Thomas Jefferson used in the Northwest Ordinance, which brought the Midwest into the United States in the 1780s. Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. So if it's good enough for Jefferson, the patriarch of our party, it should be good enough for us. Well, the South explodes over this. It's called the Wilmot Proviso. And Southerners, they did not like at all Northerners lecturing to them about slavery. And, you know, Wilmot would just say, if you say this has nothing to do with slavery, then just vote in favor of my amendment. But they wouldn't. The Wilmot Proviso is voted down, so is Polk's appropriation request. But a powerful statement was made about the future of slavery in the United States, that the North was getting tired of these never-ending capitulations to what was known as the slaveocracy. That's John Quincy Adams' great term. Because it doesn't seem to be getting us anywhere, is what many Northerners cried. So Wilmot, in the process of doing this, really energizes Democrats throughout the North, not only in New York, but in many parts of New England and in the Midwest and Wisconsin, that they're going to start taking a firmer stand against slavery and the extension of slavery, which was supposed to stop at some point, but it just keeps growing and growing and growing. Now, this movement, the Wilmot Proviso, it starts to grow in popularity. More and more states are using it as the basis for resolutions and things like that. And it starts to take on a name. And they're calling it more and more Free Soil, the Free Soil movement. Now, who are the Free Soilers and what do they stand for? Well, I've already gotten to the basis of it. It was the idea that there will be no more slavery in the United States. They were not abolitionists. I can't emphasize that enough right now. They were not an abolitionist party. They never said they wanted to abolish slavery in the South or any of the other states where it had already been established practice. But they said, they made an economic argument, and the argument was, we need to preserve these lands for homesteaders, and we cannot compete with an enslaved workforce. So it was about a matter of economic security, but there was also an idealistic element to the Free Soil movement about what is our future as a nation, and what kind of nation are we going to have if slavery, which was never designed to be something that was supposed to go on in perpetuity. It was something that most people thought in the 18th century would wither away eventually. Instead, it was growing, and there were plans to, of course, keep it growing. And in the course of making these arguments, and as the movement was growing, many of them made remarks about race that look, questionable from today's perspective. I mean, I'll quote one prominent Free Soiler from New York named Martin Grover, who was a congressman from the Albany area. He said this at a convention. He said, "The question is not whether black men are made to be free, but whether we white men are to remain free." There were remarks like this. You saw them in speeches, you saw them in newspaper articles, you saw them in all kinds of handbills and other instruments that were used for communication back then. But I do think that some historians have made a little too much of that. As ugly as some of those remarks could be, at the same time, there was, again, an idealistic element to the Free Soil movement that we're trying to make anti-slavery politics much more mainstream, to make it something that the major parties did not shy away from, which many of them did at that point. And this movement is most powerful in New York. New York is really the beating heart of the free soil movement in America. But New York, because New Yorkers have this reputation for being argumentative and difficult, I don't know where it came from, but it was in effect back then where there were two rival factions in New York. I'm going to ask you all to bear with me. I know this can be confusing. It's confusing to me, and I'm from New York, okay? There's one faction called the Barn Burners and one faction called the Hunkers. Now, there were lots of positions they were divided on, but for now, we're going to just focus on the Barn Burners were the Free Soilers. They were the ones who wanted to see a more militant Democratic Party willing to take on the slave power in America. And the Hunkers, well, I wouldn't call them pro-slavery. That would be unfair to them. But at the same time, they were much more conciliatory. They didn't want to see making the Wilmot Proviso and this question of slavery in Western lands to be a litmus test for the party, whereas the Barn Burners really did. So this sort of atmosphere is what's going to fuel the partisan politics in America for the next few years. So where is Martin Van Buren in all of this? Well, once again, he's retiring from politics, okay? And this time he seems to really be enjoying himself because he was very embittered about what happened in 1844, but he was willing to let it go, to retire from politics, and he wanted his son to be the sort of keeper of the family tradition. His son was John Van Buren, okay? And John Van Buren, like his father, was a very talented lawyer and a very talented politician. He was also a talented public speaker, which his father was not. But this was a time when public speaking is growing very much in America, and John Van Buren really uses to harness these skills of his to make a name for himself in New York politics. But at the same time, he was also bad with money, unlike his father. He liked to gamble. He made bad investments. He was very fond of the ladies. This got him into trouble too. So he had these qualities lacking in discipline that his father didn't have, and these things would come back to hurt his political career. Now, nationally, the Democrats are going in a terrible direction as far as the Free Soilers are concerned. They nominate, well, the Democratic Party, the front runner for the Democratic Party in 1848 is a guy named Lewis Cass. He is a senator from Michigan, and he is probably the most ardent war hawk in Washington. He even wants to see the United States conquer Mexico. I mean, he actually said this once on the Senate floor. So he is someone who thinks he doesn't want America to be like Europe with all these small states that are always fighting with one another. The only path to security, he thought, was to just keep acquiring territory. So from the Free Soilers' point of view, he was completely unacceptable to them. They have their own candidate in mind. Who is that? Silas Wright. They see him as somebody with the combination of the moral authority and the political smarts to really take the anti-slavery fight to the White House. Now, Silas Wright at this time, we're talking about 1847 right now, he also retires from politics. He is playing the role of the gentleman farmer. He goes to his home in upstate northern New York. He's a hay farmer, but he starts making public statements. He starts writing letters to newspapers that get circulated widely about how much he's in favor of the Wilmot Proviso. And it's looking more and more like he's going to be a candidate for the presidency, and that the Democratic Party is going to have a real dogfight between these two factions. Lewis Cass, representing the ardent, nationalist, land-acquiring sort of approach to party politics, and Silas Wright, who was much more sympathetic to the free soil point of view. Silas Wright one day drops dead of a heart attack at the age of 51. New York Democrats are absolutely devastated. They really feel like they've lost the one candidate who could carry them to victory in 1848. With Silas Wright out of the way, the nomination is going to go to Lewis Cass. There was no one else really to challenge him for the Democratic nomination. So Lewis Cass comes up with an idea that he thinks is going to solve this, and he touts this thing called popular sovereignty. The idea being that let's let the states decide if they want slavery or not. Let's let these new territories decide the future of slavery in them. So it looks like this has kind of a populist veneer to it, but it's completely unacceptable to the Free Soilers because they feel like not everything should be up to a plebiscite, that there are some things, there are moral abominations out there that are just not to be subject to a democratic vote, and this is one of them. There will be no more slavery, and they are determined to continue carrying on this fight. Now, the Whig Party, well, they've got their own problems right now. Their candidate for presidency in 1848 is Zachary Taylor, who was a general, hero of the Mexican War, but he was also a long-time enslaver himself, that he comes from a slaveholding family in Virginia. At this point, he's living in Louisiana. He owns a plantation that's got 300 slaves on it. So you've got a major a component of each of the major parties. The Democrats and the Whigs, there are anti-slavery wings in both of these parties, and they're both very upset at what their parties are doing for 1848. We've got Zachary Taylor, who is obviously an enslaver himself, who's not going to take a stand on this issue. And then you've got Lewis Cass, who just seems to want to bring new territory into the United States, and he doesn't seem to have any regard for stopping slavery in the process. As all of this is happening, once again, more and more people are asking Martin Van Buren to run for president again. Now, the Free Soilers are not looking at themselves as a breakaway party. They want to work within the Democratic Party. But Van Buren makes it clear that he is retired and that he wants to play no part in the 18. But the calls continue to come in. His son, John Van Buren, really begs him to run for president. He almost says to him, we're going to nominate you whether you like it or not, but we need you to run for president again, and we need to have a new party that's going to take a stand against slavery. And when his Albany newspaper supports Lewis Cass and supports popular sovereignty, he has a real change of heart on this subject. And furthermore, critics of the Wilmot Proviso, they're saying that they attack the patriotism of the Free Soilers, saying you are interfering with our ways of trying to find a peaceful resolution to the Mexican War. And Van Buren's really angry about this because his son, Abraham Van Buren, fought in the Mexican War, and he was badly injured. He wasn't injured during the fighting. He was injured afterward. He seemed to be suffering from what we would now call PTSD. That's my reading of the material, the medical reports about his condition. He has 2 strokes. The second one is serious. So his son's health is a real concern to him. So anybody questioning his patriotism really incenses him. So he decides that he's going to come out of retirement, but he doesn't say he's going to run for president. What he does is he sits down with his son, John, another young Democratic operative named Samuel Tilden, who would later become governor of New York, and they work on a document, a statement that they're going to present to the New York legislature, and it's going to run in party newspapers throughout the country. It's a long document, and it's called the Barn Burner Manifesto. And this is a key document because it does so much more than what the initial Wilmot Proviso does. It's really a powerful, powerful statement about the future of slavery in the United States and how it can't be allowed to continue, and the great danger we're doing to the Union by allowing it to continue. Van Buren had never taken a strong stand on slavery in his life. About the most radical thing he did was voting against, came out against the idea of making Missouri a slave state. But other than that, this is a man who had spent most of his political career really capitulating to the slave power in America. And he seems to be really changing on this subject and almost changing by the week on it. When the Barn Burner Manifesto comes out, there is once again more of a growing movement to form a party and to have Martin Van Buren run for president on it. So finally, he has one last meeting with his son and Samuel Tilden, a judge and a newspaper editor from Vermont of a Free Soil newspaper. And he says to them, why me? There are lots of people you could nominate for president. A lot of people are going to be suspect at seeing me run on your platform. Why me? And they make their argument. They say, we need somebody with name recognition. We need somebody can really carry our fight, who's had this long history in politics. We really think we need someone of your stature to run. So he finally relents. And there's a story told by the newspaper editor who was present at this meeting. He says, Van Buren comes up to him and he says, young man, you have chosen a good part. You have enlisted under the banner of free soil. Carry it forward to victory. The contest may be long. I foresee that it will not be ended by the present campaign. Slavery cannot long exist under restrictions. It must expand or perish. So those are some powerful words, and you can see that he's saying this is going to be a long fight. It's not going to end right here, but he's saying this is a good fight, and he's willing to be part of it. So the Free Soil Party, they have their convention in Buffalo in August of 1848. You know, this is a brand new party, and the election's going to be in less than 3 months. So you could imagine the reaction at the Free Soil Convention when Van Buren's name is presented as a nominee. Many people say, you've got to be kidding me. Martin Van Buren is going to be our party nominee, this long-time enabler of the slave power. We're going to look like a joke to a lot of people. And of course they said, but that's just it. Think of the powerful story here about a former president sort of renouncing his previous ways. You know, not that he quite did that. He was kind of quiet about where he stood on a lot of these issues. But at the same time, he was willing to run for president. And too many people thought, are we going to just get on our soapbox and holler and make a lot of noise, or do we actually want to win? See, this was the pragmatic argument. Do we want to just be a protest party, or we want to be a party that actually wins, elects people to Congress, elects people to state legislatures, and has an impact on American politics? So the Van Buren forces win out. He is the nominee on the Free Soil Party for president in 1848. The party that he had helped found, the Democratic Party, he turns against the party that he had helped found and that he had done so much to build and to play such a prominent role in American politics. It's a short, heated campaign. Democrats are furious at Van Buren for abandoning them. They just excoriate him in party newspapers and in speeches. Of course, the Free Soil Party does not win. Zachary Taylor is elected the 12th president of the United States. The Free Soilers don't even win any states in the Electoral College. They get about 10% of the votes, which was the most that any third party had ever gotten in an election at that stage. Many people were disappointed. Others say, considering how embryonic this party is, we made an amazing showing. They did elect some members to Congress. They did play a big role in some state legislatures, but they didn't win. And afterwards, many wanted Van Buren to continue. And he actually continued to say good things about the Free Soil Party until the fall of 1849. At that point, he withdraws from everything. He does not stick with the Free Soil Party. And he returns sort of to the Democratic Party. I'll elaborate on that in a minute. So this is where a lot of historians have come to question Van Buren's sincerity. Did he just do this as an act of revenge against the party that spurned him at the Baltimore Convention in 1844, that refused to grant his people patronage? Did he do it to get even with the Polk people and with the Democratic Party leadership? Many historians think that. I think the story is more complicated than that. So I'll give you my take now on why I think Van Buren did what he did. First of all, I want to emphasize he retired from politics. He returned to the Democrats of sorts, okay? But it's not like he became active in the party. It's not like he started supporting and started stumping on behalf of Democratic Party nominees in 1852 and 1856. It wasn't like that. He was largely out of politics by now. So it's not quite accurate to make it sound like he enthusiastically rejoined the Democrats. Another side of this story that doesn't get a lot of attention. One of his sons became very ill. Martin Van Buren Jr. came down with tuberculosis in 1841. They had kept it at bay for many years. His conditions were not serious. In October of 1849, they get very serious, and that is the time when Van Buren retires and withdraws from politics. So I think a big part of this was he wanted to take care of his son. He takes him to spas in New England. They go to Europe. This was something many people did back then because tuberculosis was a real terrible health scourge in 19th century America. They called it consumption because it consumed away at the body. There was no cure for it. There were very few ways to treat it. So Van Buren takes his son to Europe. They go to the Mediterranean. They go to Italy. They go to spas. They spend a lot of time in the Mediterranean Sea. It's a lovely way to spend a vacation, and he did this for quite some time, trying to rejuvenate his son's health, and it seemed to have a little bit of a positive impact on him, but not for long. Martin Van Buren Jr. dies in Paris in 1855, and he dies suddenly, which is how many tuberculosis victims went back then. They were having dinner one night, and his son just lowers his head and dies right at the dinner table. So this was, of course, a devastating personal loss because of all of Van Buren's children. Martin Jr. was the one who never got married. His only career was serving his father. He was his private secretary. He had been spending time with him, helping him work on his memoirs. So this personal loss for him really took a lot out of him. And I think this plays another big role into why he really got out of the political game at that time. Another factor is the New York Democrats, they reconciled a bit after the 1848 election. The barn burners and the hunkers. There was a realization that if we're divided, then the Whigs are going to win everything. And the Whigs did win everything. Zachary Taylor won the presidency. A Whig won the governor's race. A Whig won the attorney general's race. All the patronage was going to the Whigs. So the Democrats had to figure out a way to work together. They didn't resolve their issues. This question of slavery was still a big dividing point, but the party found a way to unite, and John Van Buren played a big role in brokering this compromise. So at this stage, Van Buren was really all about just letting his son take over the reins of the party, and he was not going to interfere in that. So this was a personal issue for him on several levels. And on a larger level, let me just say, the whole party system was imploding at the time. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Free Soil Party broke up after the 1852 election. The Whig Party broke up after and all these other new parties started popping up. So it was a time of really great uncertainty. So before anybody judges Van Buren for saying, his run for the presidency was not sincere at all, that he was just doing this as an act of revenge. You know, we forget that we know how things turned out, and they didn't. That they were living in real time, and they were making decisions based on what they thought was the best at the time. I want to cite another thing, because these anti-Van Buren historians who charge him with insincerity, a lot of them like to cite a letter. Okay, there's one letter in 1852 that was, he wrote to a guy named Andrew Beaumont, absolutely unknown congressman from Pennsylvania, who wrote to Van Buren. He said, hey, why did you run on the free soil ticket? And Van Buren wrote him back a long letter, and he has this line: he did it as an exceedingly unpleasant but unavoidable sacrifice to my friends. So again, that letter has given some of these historians the ammunition to say, aha, here's your proof that Van Buren was never sincere. Well, I have a problem with this. I don't think you can take these complex historical issues and reduce them to one letter. So you can look at that letter, or you can take a look at some of the things Van Buren wrote. In the Barn Burner Manifesto, he writes, Southern Democrats, quote, have entered in a race as to which should outstrip the other in defending and propagating slavery. Out of this ill-starred rivalry have sprung the extraordinary doctrines which we have brought to the test of truth and justice. Northern Democrats, he adds, who go along with this will soon be buried under a lot of public obloquy in a grave from which there will be no resurrection. So pretty strong words, and this manifesto is filled with them. So you can look at all this and say, this was all an act. This was just a way of getting even with the people who foiled him years earlier. Well, it seems to me that there's a lot of evidence to suggest otherwise. You can look at a nobody named Andrew Beaumont, or you can look at some of the abolitionists who were in the fight at the time. One is Henry B. Stanton, a great abolitionist from this period, who was also the husband to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the great feminist pioneer, who went to go see Van Buren in the late 1850s, and they talked about the Free Soil campaign. And Van Buren said to him that his evolution on this subject reflected his, quote, matured convictions. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he really was changing a bit on this. And Stanton wrote, I feel constrained to pay peculiar honors to Mr. Van Buren for the course he and his followers pursued in 1847-48 in regard to the extension of slavery. This is the key sentence here. Their protest at the ballot boxes in that crucial emergency was the turning point in the great controversy that ultimated 15 years later in the overthrow of the institution and the preservation of the Union. So the people who were living at that time, had a very different take on the free soil movement and the role it played in ending slavery in America. Now, I want to be clear on something here. I'm not suggesting that Van Buren deserves a place alongside William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass as a great anti-slavery crusader. His contribution to this issue, I think, was modest at best. But it was something. He seemed to recognize later in life that this monster that he had helped create was destroying the nation, was consuming the nation, and he seemed to be willing to do something to turn the tide. And that's a lot more that can be said for the other presidents who fell between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. Thank you very much. Okay. I believe I'll be taking questions now.
Yeah, so if you have a question,
And it can be
raise your
about
hand.
anything. It doesn't have to be about the subject, anything about Van Buren. Just don't ask me why are the papers of Martin Van Buren at Cumberland. I've been getting too much of that.
If anyone has a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you.
I was just wondering, so Martin Van Buren's son, Martin Van Buren Jr. passed away, but I was wondering if you could speak to Abraham, who was suffering from PTSD, and how that might have affected Martin Van Buren later on in life.
Well, I know he was worried very much about it. He writes in his letters about how he's keeping a close watch on Abraham. Walking and talking forever remained a problem for him. He was never able to regain his physical abilities. And he was still a young man. He was in his early 40s back then. He did have a lot of money, not only his father's money, but his wife, Angelica Singleton Van Buren, came from a lot of money as well. So resources were not a problem. So they were able to get that kind of round-the-clock help that he needed to carry on with his life. But it was pretty severe, what he went through. And You see it in his letters about how concerned he was about Abraham, who dies in 1873. So he did live for quite a bit longer, but again, he struggled because of the stroke that seems to have been, you hear about his role in the Mexican War. He was close to Winfield Scott. He was sort of his aide-de-camp. He was in charge of money. He would bring a lot. He was sort of the paymaster, the army paymaster, and he was involved in a lot of key battles. But at first he wasn't. He was just had a desk job, and he said, "I want to be in the action." And he was in the action, all right. He was in some of the great battles of the Mexican War, and it seems to have had a really devastating effect on his personal health, which of course concerned his father very much.
Other questions?
If he were, if he were to have been for the annexation of Texas, what do you think his effect, if he would have been reelected as president, have been? And do you think it would have affected us now, or if there would have been any relevance to him, or more relevance to him now?
You're saying if he had not come out against the annexation of Texas in 1844, because we call these counterfactual questions, which historians are very afraid of tackling, but at the time, Andrew Jackson erupted when he saw this letter. He was in his last throes, but he still had this vital spirit, and he said, why did he do this? Why didn't he come to me? I would have helped him phrase it in a way that would have won over Northerners and kept the South, not so negative about him. So it's a great question. What would have happened if he had done things? I think he would have very likely won, because certainly that was a year for the Democrats in 1844. This was a trap set up for him, and the trap was set up by John C. Calhoun, who made sure that, because he wanted to run for president in 1844, but he didn't get anywhere. He had to withdraw from the nomination, and he becomes Secretary of State because there is an explosion on a battleship, not during any war fighting, but they're on a ship and they're showing an exhibition of firing cannons, and the cannon explodes, and 6 people are killed, including half of Tyler's cabinet, including the Secretary of State. So John C. Calhoun becomes the Secretary of State, and he's not only here to be a diplomat, but he's here to make mischief for Martin Van Buren. And one of the things he's going to do is to get him to take this stance on Texas. So it's a fascinating twist in the story, which all of history is based on fascinating twists. And this is one of them, that this was something that his enemies had set up for him, and he just felt the need to be straightforward. Now, by his standards, he was being straightforward, of course, but he wrote this very long letter where he just thought he found a middle ground there, but there was no placating the slavocracy on this one.
I'm trying to understand, I guess. This is my first hearing, so I wanted to thank you for sharing about Martin, but I'm not familiar with him at all. So it seems to me that the public persona was that he was a pro-slavery person, and during his lifetime regretted his contributions and wanted to make a meager amends in any way he could. We hear a lot today about people being concerned over history being rewritten, and it seems that rather than rewriting history, we are now telling the full stories as you're uncovering. So I'm wondering why this information you mentioned is being restricted on the White House level? Is that what you were trying to say, that you're
You mean
having
earlier
trouble?
what I was no, I was
Yes.
talking about the papers of Martin Van Buren as being threatened right now because of the cuts to the National Endowment of the Humanities and another governmental institution that finances us. So I'm talking about the budget cuts that are going to cut off our economic lifeblood.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's not that someone's somewhere is saying we're not allowed to know these things.
No.
Okay,
No.
thank you.
History is always being rewritten, by the way. That's just there's no one history. History is my book is my interpretation of Van Buren's life and the issues that surrounded his life. And other people will have different takes, and you'll read and judge for yourselves.
Other questions?
Right in front of you.
Sorry, Kat.
I thought you might be ignoring me because I talked too much already. So aside from his, running with the Free Soil Party, is there any evidence of other like anti-slavery activism or participation from Martin Van Buren? Did he participate in any organizations or make any speeches, or even write about, having any anti-slavery sentiments?
You mean afterwards, or you mean throughout his life? About
Either way,
either way.
I think more like, I don't know, yeah, both sides, I guess, like pre-Free Soil and post.
One of the things I didn't get into was that when his son died, he was working on his memoirs, which is something I alluded to in the talk. But his memoirs end abruptly. And because of that, and I think it's because his son died, it wasn't just that he was personally distraught over this, but his son was doing all the heavy lifting. He was doing all the transcribing. He was doing the research. He couldn't do it all on his own, and his other children didn't want to really be part of it either. So it was losing Martin Van Buren sort of took the wind out of his sails to finish his memoir. And because of that, we don't really know more about his presidency and his decision to run on the Free Soil Party ticket. It's not something he wrote about in his memoirs or any other public statements. So I think it's that kind of void in the record that has given this period open to such interpretation. Even though, again, he made many remarks at the time, and even I was surprised to see him saying he was invited to a Free Soil Convention in Ohio in 1849, and he says, "I'm sorry I can't go, I've got too many things going on," but he says, "I applaud what you're doing." So he still shows support for the Free Soil movement and what they're doing, but pretty soon it comes to an abrupt stop for all the reasons that I've stated already.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's been really, really insightful. Obviously, as you said, Martin Van Buren retired from the limelight and retired from politics, but obviously he lived up until the very beginnings of the Civil War. I wonder, did he ever offer any public commentary or any private commentary, perhaps, that you've seen on the events leading up to the Civil War or the Civil War's breakout itself? Because I think he overlapped just slightly as the Civil War began.
Yes. He dies in July of 1862. So at that stage, the war had been going on for more than a year. It was going very, very badly for the North at that time. So at the very end of his life, there seems to be a real dejection in him that not only is the future of his party very much in doubt, the future of his country is in doubt. The Democrats, the Southern Democrats, join the Confederacy en masse. I mean, there's one exception, I think, and that's Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. Otherwise, Southern Democrats, they show absolutely no fealty to the nation they had been serving for so long. So all of this dejects Van Buren very much. He wrote about how much he was against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He makes a few public statements after the war breaks out saying we must support Abraham Lincoln. He had been critical of Lincoln a little bit. He had been critical before then about this new Republican Party. He he just had this line about Republicans, they were the successors to the Whigs, and the Whigs, he saw they were successors to the Federalists. He always saw these people as the opposition. So he was critical of Lincoln because that was the partisan in him. But once the war broke out, he called it treason, he called it dastardly, he said a few pretty harsh things about the Confederacy of America, and so he was clearly not supportive at all, and his son wasn't either. There was a part of the Democratic Party called the Copperheads who were looking to cut a deal with the Confederacy to end the war and find a way for these two nations to work. John Van Buren never joined the Copperheads, but he was still a Democrat who supported George McClellan in 1864 and not Abraham Lincoln. So they were still Democrats till the end there.
Let me ask for our final question, besides what you've talked about tonight, why should we care about Martin Van Buren today? What is it about him that has such a lasting legacy that's important for us to know about in the year 2025?
I think he led a very deeply interesting life. I wouldn't have written this book if I didn't think otherwise. We learn this story about how the son of a tavern keeper becomes president of the United States. So that gives us an indication of what this nation is capable of. Okay, he didn't rise from poverty. Poverty is too strong a word. The father had some money. They owned enough property where they could vote. That was a big deal in New York at the time. But his background was very humble. He didn't come from a big landed family, and really through hard work and guile and industry, became a powerful lawyer and a powerful politician. So his rise, in many ways, I think, reflects well on our country. And his lasting legacy is the party system. Now, I know these days the party system is not looking like a very positive thing in American life. No one's been able to think up of much of an alternative. Okay, throughout the world, throughout the industrialized world where they have democracies, we also have political parties. Now, Van Buren didn't do all of this. I don't want to make it sound like he concocted this whole thing himself. But in America, at least, he played a formative role in not just the Democratic Party, but the party system, this idea that political parties should have an organization, a structure, a personality, that's got to be a way to connect with people, and putting forward candidates who connect with people. And this was not just a way to win elections, but also to further democracy. In order for democracy to survive, we need citizens to be engaged. And one vehicle for citizens to be engaged was through a political party. And it's no coincidence, I think, that the Democratic Party is the longest running political party in the world. I think this institution that he created, even he couldn't defeat it when he ran against it in 1848. That's how strong it was. So the fact that we still have a party system in place, that we have had uninterrupted quadrennial elections since the late 18th century, I mean, I think all of this shows the durability of the party system and that formative role it plays in our civic culture.
Please join me in thanking James Bradley once again. So he will be over here at the table if you want to come talk to him or buy a book or both. If you're here for credit for a class, there's a yellow sheet of paper here at the front. I encourage you to put your name and your professor's name next to your name so that you get proper credit if you're doing that. Thank you again for coming out. We really appreciate it. Have a good evening.